Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. They still haven't gotten me a new memory card yet, so I've basically given up on using the camcorder for the last two lectures. So we've done this twice now without it crashing to the ground, so maybe we can make it through these two as well. So, we're going to talk about the modulatory functions of the brainstem today. Usually Dr. Etheridge for this lecture actually talks about, I believe it's chapter 64, which is autism and other genetic type disorders. My expertise is not in autism, and so she can speak to that much better than I can. And so if I wanted to talk about my research or things that I was interested in, I was sort of narrowed down between the emotional processing chapter and this chapter. And since we already talk about mood disorders and anxiety disorders, and we get some of that emotional processing stuff in there, we landed on this one instead. And so we only have one lecture for this because I want to be sure we can do a full review on Wednesday. And so we're going to sort of do a really, really quick overview and then hopefully get into some of the actual research areas that some of this pertains to. And so if I'm going too fast, please let me know and I can try to slow down a little bit. And so we know from our work at the very beginning of the semester that the brainstem is basically our most evolutionarily conserved part of our brain. So this is something that most beings are going to have some sort of significant function in, even if they don't have a well-developed cortex like humans have. And so because it's so evolutionarily conserved, it makes a lot of sense to consider that this is primarily responsible for those reflexive things that are going to keep us alive. Things like breathing, things like swallowing, those are all going to be mediated by this area here. But what we also know is that while we associate with this with some of those sort of like basic life processes, is that neurons contained in this area actually project super, super widely to other areas of the brain, including cortical areas. And so while we don't necessarily associate the brainstem with higher order cognitive processes, the truth is that there are projections from this area that sort of help facilitate some of those things as we think of as being uniquely human or particularly related to cortical functioning. And so this is sort of there's a lot going on here, but this is sort of a general overview of the stuff that we talked about at the very beginning of the chapter. So we know that the brainstem is made up, what you have is your nerves coming in through your spinal cord here. Try to find the good one. So this is probably the best one that gives the best overview. So you have your spinal cord here is connected to your medulla oblongata, which is then connected to the pons. You have your midbrain right here in this area, and then all of the information is sort of directly routed up on through into the thalamus. And so do you guys remember what the thalamus is sort of particularly important for?
Integrating thoughts.
Integration is you're close on the thought thing. The integration is the important part, right? It's integration particularly of sensory information. And so what you have, because the spinal cord is sort of the routing center for a number of different nerves coming through, what you get is things like audition, I believe nose, I can't remember the term is escaping me, but smell is one, I think the only one that doesn't actually come through this center. So what we see, we're going to skip all the way to the end here really quick, is that your optical impulses obviously are going to come in a little bit more directly, but you have auditory impulses, you have other sensory tracts such as pain, touch, and temperature are all being routed up through your brainstem for integration into the thalamus and then for sort of projection on out into the cortical areas that need those types of sensory cues to then make decisions on things like your environment, activity, et cetera, et cetera. And so, again, we think of this as being sort of a basic processing center, but what's happening here is really, really complex. And the idea of integrating all of that sensory input is going to actually become really important when we talk about actually personality later in the lecture. And so I don't expect you to, like, there's a lot going on here, right? I don't expect you to know the nerves that are being routed through here. What I do want you to know and which should be a general review from our very first chapter, is the structures vaguely or in an overview that are making up the brainstem. So again, spinal cord, medulla oblongata, you have your pons, midbrain, and your thalamus. Make sense? Okay. All right, so what makes the brainstem particularly good at modulating the function of other areas of the brain is the neurons that are contained within the brainstem. And so what we see is that there are a number of different monoamine neurons. There are a number of different cholinergic neurons that are sort of situated in this area that are then projecting out into other cortical areas. And so, again, we have a really nice list right here. There are 4 main locations within the brainstem where we see sort of groups of neurons that are then involved in modulatory function. And so the first is the locus coeruleus. The locus coeruleus is going to contain noradrenergic, so this is your norepinephrine neurons. And these are going to be important for things like regulating attention, important for regulating general arousal. You also have your dorsal and medial raphe nuclei, which we talked about in relation to serotonin, right? To serotonin processing. And so what we see is not only is serotonin important for things like neuroprotectant of the hippocampus, important for processing emotion, it's also important for a number of other functions, things even like regulating actually your breathing, which we'll talk about more later. You also have some dopaminergic neurons here, which we know is important for reward learning and reward processing. I'm probably going to butcher this. The pendunculopontine, we'll see, we'll go with that. This guy here, and the laterodorsal tegmental nuclei, this is where you have your cholinergic neurons that are primarily situated in the brainstem. And so these are also going to be important for regulating arousal, which is going to be a theme as we go through this chapter. That idea of wakefulness, alertness is really important in terms of the brainstem function. And these neurons are actually important for modulating motor activity. Because we only have a 50-minute class, we're not actually going to talk about motor activity today, but there is some information on that in your textbook if you're interested. And finally, you have your tubomammillary nucleus, which is where your histaminergic neurons are. And so when we talked about neurotransmitter function, we talked about histamine, right? This is another thing that's going to be important for whether you're feeling awake or whether you're feeling drowsy, right? That's why antihistamines are known for actually causing drowsiness. So, tells you where it is, it tells you what's happening, and then as we go through the chapter, we're going to talk about some of these guys individually. So again, lists are always good, so maybe note that. So some of the various modulatory functions that we're going to talk about today are wakefulness versus sleepiness and arousal. Sometimes those are talked about distinctly. For the sake of time, we're going to sort of lump them together today. We're also going to talk about cognitive performance, which again is one of those things that we think about as being primarily associated with cortical function. So this is evidence again that you actually have your brainstem that's helping aid in that sort of function as well. We're going to talk about the autonomic regulation and breathing, and then we're going to talk a little bit about pain and nociception. I always say it wrong, but close enough. Okay. So wakefulness, sleepiness, and arousal. This is what the brainstem is primarily responsible for. So there are a number of different areas of the brainstem. There are a number of different neurons within the brainstem that are important for sort of aiding in this process. And so the first is we have monoaminergic pathways from the locus coeruleus. So locus coeruleus, that's going to be norepinephrine, remember? And the dorsal and median raphe nuclei, so that's going to be serotonin. So what we're seeing here is that both norepinephrine and serotonin are important for regulating whether you're feeling awake or whether you're feeling sleepy. There are also neurons in the parabrachial nucleus and in the rostral, pons, and caudal membrane. There's a lot of really tough words here. This is going to be a lot of stammering on my part, but we'll get through it. And then finally, there are cholinergic and GABAergic neurons in the basal forebrain that are also going to sort of aid in differentiation between whether or not you're awake or whether you're feeling awake or feeling sleepy. I could spend an entire lecture talking about this. So in general, what I want you to take from that slide is specifically that there are a number of different pathways that are sort of involved in regulating whether or not you're feeling awake or feeling sleepy. And it's interplay between those pathways that's actually going to create what state you're currently in, whether you're drowsy or whether you're not. And so, again, we won't go into all of this, but what we see is that there are certain neurons that are going to fire more when you're awake, and there are certain neurons that are going to fire more when you're asleep. And so the interplay between which neurons are firing when is sort of going to dictate what state you're in. And this relates primarily to arousal. So we've up here, the pathways we talked about on the previous slide are particularly important for wake versus sleep. What we know though is that there are a number of different neurons that are actually projecting to your cortical areas directly to monitor whether or not you are physiologically aroused. And so some of the areas that they're actually going to route through, if they're not actually activating your cortex directly, are going to be your hypothalamus, your basal forebrain, and your thalamus. So the one that I want to draw attention to here is going to be your thalamus. So remember, we talked about sensory integration. And so what's happening is you have a number of different inputs that are coming in through your brainstem. And then your thalamus is sort of the way station for deciding what's important or not, right? And so because the thalamus is important in, again, we're not going to talk about it as much in terms of dictating attention, but because the thalamus is important for regulating what you're actually attending to, all of the different information coming in through your brainstem into your thalamus is sort of then going to dictate what goes out to your cortex to decide what you should be focusing on and what you should be paying attention to. So, broad overview. Okay, perfect. So, cognitive performance, again, is one of those things that we generally consider to be a higher order process. And so it's not necessarily intuitive to consider our brainstem, which is often considered sort of a reptilian brain structure, as actually being involved in your higher order thinking as well. And so what we see is, again, that norepinephrine, this makes a lot of sense, right? It's going to, we know what it does to your sympathetic nervous system. It's also important for dictating what you're paying attention to. And so what they've seen from research actually using monkeys in many cases shows that monkeys that are in a drowsy state or monkeys that are sort of sleepy, what you get is a really low level of firing from these norepinephrine neurons in your locus coeruleus. And so this makes a lot of sense. When you're sleepy, you're not paying as much attention, right? There's not as much firing telling them there's something that they need to be attending to. When they're more awake, there are actually two different kinds of firing that you see. You see phasic firing, and you see tonic firing. And so phasic firing, that essentially is referring to, there's sort of a low to moderate level of firing, and then when a stimulus is presented, you get sort of a big spike, right? And so that then is telling you, there's your stimulus, you need to be attending to that stimulus, essentially. With tonic firing, what you get is sort of just this steady state firing rather than low to moderate firing and then a big spike. It's just firing pretty continuously, which is fine, right? You might be generally attentive to overall environment that you're in, but that makes it more difficult for you to attend selectively to a particular stimulus. So when you have a pretty constant level of firing, and no differentiation between low and then higher when a stimulus is presented, it's again, you're not selectively attending to whatever's being demonstrated. And so what we see is that your phasic firing is particularly important for selective attention. Red flag, phasic firing, selective attention, right? Make sense? Okay. Monoaminergic inputs to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex also appear to be important for cognition. So there's not really a super great understanding of why this seems to be the case. But what we know is that if you input if you stimulate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with monoaminergic inputs, what you get is it's pretty short, but a significant increase in working memory. So like 4 to 5 seconds longer, individuals are able to sort of attend to, remember, and then recall whatever stimulus that you've given them. And then finally, this is something that we've talked about a lot, simply because dopamine seems to be involved in things like schizophrenia. But it's important for reward processing. And so because you have dopaminergic inputs coming from your raphe nuclei, remember that's particularly associated with serotonin, but you do get some dopaminergic neurons there as well. Inputs from the raphe nuclei then, particularly those that are using dopamine neurons, are actually linked to reward-based learning as well. And so this is like your typical operant conditioning, right? So you are giving an individual, you're rewarding them for whatever behavior. So this is like when you train your dog, this is what's going on there. So inputs potentially from the brainstem are increasing the likelihood that your little puppy, when you give him a treat after he sits, is going to learn that sit means treat, right? Make sense? Okay. All right. So in terms of autonomic regulation and breathing, we know that serotonin is actually really important for this. Serotonin is interesting in that it actually plays a role in a number of different, sort of what we think of as being like reflexive processing. So it's important, for example, for peristalsis in your gut, so it helps get movement of food matter and things through your intestines. It's important for regulating things like blood pressure and heart rate as well. Here what we see is that serotonergic neurons in the brainstem particularly seem to function as what we call central chemoreceptors. So that means that they're literally sensing some sort of chemical and then basing their activity on presence or absence of said chemical. And so in this case, they're functioning basically as CO2 sensors. And so this again, if you have a lot of CO2, it's going to indicate that you don't have enough oxygen, right? And so if, extreme example, but like if I were to come over and like put a pillow on one of your faces, I would never do this. If I did, these receptors are immediately gonna start firing, maybe not immediately. As you have less oxygen, they're gonna start firing really quickly and telling your body something bad is happening, you can't breathe, right? And so the less oxygen you have, the more CO2 you have, the more these guys are gonna fire. And they're meant to essentially stimulate sort of a survival response. So you're gonna get some sort of like greater arousal, for instance. So if this is happening while you're sleeping, it's gonna wake you up, theoretically. Again, we don't do this, but it also, it might give you feelings of anxiety. So if you know, when you're being, maybe nobody else has ever had this happen, but like if you're being tickled and you can't breathe, it starts like you're just being tickled, like it's not gonna hurt you, but it starts to get kind of scary because you can't breathe, right? That's these guys too telling you like, hey, you can't breathe, this is not cool, you should be feeling something, whether it's anxiety, arousal, et cetera, et cetera. And this essentially is going to stimulate you breathing more to sort of put that CO2, O2 level back in balance where it should be. And this is really interesting and really important because it's been associated actually with sudden infant death syndrome. So are you guys like relatively familiar with what that is? Yeah, I see lots of heads nodding. So for those of you that might not be as familiar, sudden infant death syndrome, it's actually on the decrease as of late. But what you see is that you'll have infants like in a crib, for instance, that die. And there doesn't seem to be, you can't, parents, morticians are sort of stumped in terms of what actually happened. It seemed to be a particularly healthy baby, no medical health issues that would sort of warrant them dying prematurely. It seems in many cases that in these infants, most of them seem to have either immature morphology of their serotonergic neurons in the raphe nuclei. Some of them have decreased levels of serotonin itself. Or some of them just don't have as many serotonergic neurons in this area. And so this seems to say that potentially what's happening here with these individuals, or with these babies, is that they're not getting enough oxygen, but there aren't enough of these neurons to sort of alert them and cause some sort of response that's going to allow them to take in more oxygen. And so a huge campaign that they've had, I think in the last 10 years probably, for sudden infant death syndrome is this back to sleep idea. And so this is, you keep the blankets out of the crib, you don't have pillows or anything, and you lay them to sleep on their back. And this has decreased sudden infant death syndrome by a huge amount, and it seems to be related to the fact that they're less likely to not be able to breathe and not know it. And so what you see happening here, so this is an example of your, essentially what's happening in terms of the modulation of this pathway. So here you have a respiratory neuron in the medulla, which is connected then to motor neurons in the diaphragm, so this is going to stimulate the breathing. And then CO2 sensitive serotonergic neuron, which is linking both of these things, telling them, the respiratory neuron, hey, you don't have enough oxygen, breathe, right? And so what seems to be happening with sudden infant death syndrome is there is dysfunction in these serotonergic neurons. So that could be something which then causes either breathing instability, it could be caused by an immature brainstem. And then when there's an airway obstruction, so for instance, if the baby rolls over on its stomach and has its face pressed against the mattress, where it essentially can't breathe, because there's serotonergic dysfunction, they don't detect that. And then they aren't wakened, they don't experience any feeling of not being able to breathe. And because they can't detect that they're not breathing, there's no way for them to sort of either roll over or do something else, start crying, whatever, to rectify that situation. And so you end up then with basically hypoxia, right? They have a lack of oxygen, and that seems to be the cause of death. And so this idea that it's an inability to detect when you're not getting enough air has been a huge breakthrough in sort of allowing parents to know what are best practices in terms of trying to prevent this from happening, right? So you might not actually know if your baby has dysfunction in these neurons, but what we do know is that if you decrease the likelihood that they're going to be put in a situation where they can't breathe, even if they have an immature brainstem, for instance, it's going to be less likely that they're going to die because there isn't a situation in which they need to be sort of detecting CO2 levels. Does this make sense? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about pain. So what we see here is, again, unsurprisingly, serotonin seems to be particularly important for this, right? If you get one thing from this entire class, take away how important serotonin is for so many different things. And so what we see here is that the serotonergic neurons, again, in the medulla, are actually projecting back down. So this is a descending pathway. You can see it right here. Descending back down into the dorsal horn, essentially, of your spinal cord, where they can then modulate the processing of pain. And so we know does anybody watch Grey's Anatomy in here? Yeah, I see a few hands. So there's an episode with a little girl who can't feel pain, and she ends up letting somebody hit her in the stomach with a baseball bat and has all these catastrophic internal injuries because she can't feel pain, right? And what we know is that the experience of pain is super, super important for survival. You're less likely to do things like letting somebody hit you with a baseball bat if you know it's really gonna hurt. And so to a certain extent, it's important for us to feel pain. But at the same time, if the experience of pain is going to impede you from doing something like running away from whatever caused you pain, it becomes maladaptive at that point. And so there's a need then to sort of modulate those pain responses, particularly in situations in which you might need to escape, right? And so what we see is that these serotonergic neurons are what are responsible for that. So they project back on to the dorsal horn, along with a number of other different neurotransmitters that we're, for the sake of time today, not going to talk about. But the idea is they then essentially are sort of blunting that pain response. Make sense? Very cool stuff. All right, so we're going to spend the last about 20 minutes talking about actually personality. And so typically when individuals think of personality, some of them might think about biology, most of them don't, it seems. And they're particularly not going to be thinking about the brainstem. And so this connection here isn't always intuitive for individuals, but hopefully by the end you guys will sort of see where this theory is sort of coming from. So one of the formative personality psychologists that was responsible for sort of drawing attention to biology as being important for personality was an individual by the name of Hans Eysenck. And so Hans Eysenck proposed a biologically based theory of personality that was essentially sort of founded on this idea that individuals, their brains function differently, right? And particularly what seems to be important for differential functioning of individuals, particularly in terms of things like introversion and extroversion, seems to be the functioning of the central nervous system. And so when you look behaviorally at introverts versus extroverts, what you see is there seems to be basic differences in levels of arousal, right? And so you see introverts as potentially being more reserved and extroverts as being more outgoing, more easily stimulated, things like that. And this was sort of the general observation that Eysenck used when he was creating his theory. And so he thought that, he also talked about neuroticism, which we are probably not going to have time to talk about today, so I didn't include it. We're going to talk a little bit more about introversion and extroversion. But his idea was that because there seemed to be differences in basic levels of arousal in terms of behaviors, that what actually might account for differences in personality is differential activation in your brainstem, in your ascending reticular activating system. And so your book talks a little bit about using the term, the term ascending reticular activating system isn't used quite as frequently today. It's still used in terms of Eysenck's theory, so that's the way that we're going to talk about it. But essentially, again, this is sort of a general theme that we've talked about today. There are ascending pathways. You're getting sensory information coming in through your brainstem, and levels of arousal or excitability that are typical within this pathway are what is going to dictate whether or not you're an introvert or whether you're an extrovert. So what we see when you think of an extrovert, so it's up, there are options up here, but how would you typically characterize an extrovert behaviorally? What words would you use to describe them? Yeah.
Annoying because they're always excited.
An extrovert, annoying. I've spoken like a true introvert, that's funny. So they seem to be super excited, right? Super outgoing, they have lots of friends, they like to go to parties. What else? Anything else you can think of?
I think that pretty much sums it up.
Pretty much sums it up, yeah. So another thing that you typically see that you might not expect as much, right, is if you are going to go to a friend and you're going to say, hey, let's go skydiving, who are you going to go to? Are you going to go to an introvert or are you going to go to an extrovert? I'm hearing different answers. This is interesting. What do you guys think? Raise your hand for introvert. Okay, one. Extrovert. Okay, some more people for extrovert. Maybe I was missing people. So it's true. It's an extrovert. Extroverts are typically more likely to engage in behaviors that are going to be sort of exciting by nature, right? That are going to be more heavily stimulating. And so what we see, or a term that's typically used to describe extroverts, is sensation seeking. So it's this idea that you're seeking out experiences, you're seeking out things that are sort of gonna make your heart rate rise. You're gonna be more willing to do things that are a little bit riskier if you're an extrovert. So what about introverts? How would you characterize an introvert then? Are there any extroverts in here that would like to respond? Do we also think introverts are annoying? No? That seems to not be the general consensus. That's funny. What words would you use? Shy, yeah, right? What else?
Less expressive.
Less expressive, that's a good one. Anything else? You can say the ones that are up here too. Reserved, that's a good one as well. So it's the idea that they seem to be more likely to keep to themselves, maybe, quieter, less likely certainly to go out and skydive potentially, right? And this actually, what Eysenck proposed is that things like excitability and willingness to engage in those behaviors is related primarily to levels of arousal in your ascending reticular activating system. And so again, this isn't, pay attention here because it's not necessarily intuitive. What you see is that introverts actually, if we're talking particularly about like clinically like far into the bell curve introverts, they're gonna have really high levels of arousal in their ascending reticular activating system. So like super alert at all times, like there's a lot, stimuli that are coming in are going to be particularly salient to those individuals. And so what we see is that a desire to be more reserved, to be a little bit more reclusive perhaps, is actually an attempt to bring down those levels of arousal to like an optimum level. Whereas with extroverts, what you have is like a chronically low level of ascending reticular activating system arousal, right? So not as much natural excitement, you might describe this as happening. And so what they do then is they go out and they seek those experiences that are gonna up those levels of physiological arousal to a more optimum level. So this idea of differential arousal actually accounts for differences in behavior, so what we see. So again, introverts are gonna have those higher levels of arousal, which is essentially another way of saying that is that they have a lower threshold for arousal. It takes less to get them to a point where they're super aroused. So you might not have to take them take them to see a crazy scary movie, right? Something that's more like easy thriller might be fine to get those levels of arousal up, right? You might be able to put them have anybody ever been to Disney World? Like on the Dumbo flying little guy, that might be enough compared to like going on a crazy roller coaster, right? Whereas for extroverts, they have a higher threshold. So to get them to that optimal level, there's like people staring at the window, which is kind of strange, but it's fine. Like literally like face up against the glass. Easily distracted, you can probably guess what I am from that. Higher threshold for arousal, so it takes more to get them to that point. So the flying Dumbo, like up and that's not gonna do it, right? You're gonna need like the big crazy roller coaster with all the turns and all the spins to sort of hit that peak level of arousal, right? And what's actually really interesting, and what I really like to talk about, because actually my advisor and her advisor before her were actually really instrumental in conducting some of this research, is that you can see these differences on EEG, and they correspond super well to Eysenck's first personality inventory, his EPI. And so this is an example of what we call an auditory evoked potential. And so if you're having individuals listen to auditory noises, you get activation in the ascending reticular activating system because that's where your auditory impulses are routed through, right? And so what we see is that you get differential activation in response to auditory stimuli between introverts and extroverts. And so this makes a lot of sense when you consider that levels of arousal are going to be important for attending to stimuli. So if you are already like super, super highly aroused, and you hear like a twig snap behind you, you're going to like whip around, right? You're going to hear that super, super quickly. If you have a lower level of arousal, it might take more to grab your attention. And so what we see is that this wave right here is actually back further in extroverts. So essentially what that means is that introverts, you're getting activation more quickly in response to auditory stimuli in an introvert than in an extrovert. And that makes a lot of sense when you think that introverts are already more aroused, which allows them to attend to that stimuli a little bit more quickly. Does that make sense? Sometimes this is not intuitive for people. The latency is longer for extroverts, right? So it takes longer for you to see activation when they hear a noise. We're on the same page? Perfect. All right. That took way shorter than I thought it would. Does anybody have any questions? No. Okay, so I'm going to go back through really quick. We're going to review again on Wednesday, but I want to highlight some of the things from this lecture just in case. I'm going to plan ahead of time how I go through the review so there's nothing that we have left out, but I'm going to go ahead and go through this one now since we're here. So for your review for this chapter, again, it is important for you guys to know which areas of the brain are actually a part of the brainstem. And so thalamus isn't always included. It's typically your medulla, your pons, and your midbrain that are considered to be brainstem. We talk about the thalamus here because it's important in terms of routing information. So these are the three that I expect you to know and be able to potentially list, something like that, or be able to pick out of a lineup. So it is important for you guys to understand or to know the general locations of the neurons that are important for modulatory function. And as a general sort of overarching theme, you should also know what these are important for. So again, we talked about the noradrenergic neurons as being important for selective attention, attention just in general, really. We talked about the serotonergic neurons as being important for regulating a number of different things, actually. We talked about sleep, wakefulness. We talked about chemoreception and regulation of breathing. For the cholinergic neurons, this is also going to be responsible for sleep versus wake. We didn't talk about motor activity today, and I wouldn't expect you to know their relationship to motor activity in any sort of detail. What I would expect you to know is that they modulate motor function in addition to sleep and wake. And then our tubomammillary nuclei, you have your histaminergic neurons, which again are responsible for regulating drowsiness and sleep. Everybody good on that? Okay. All right, so in general here, if you know this list and you know what these neurons are responsible for, that's what I would expect you to know in terms of the particular modulatory function. Some other things that might be to your benefit to know, some other things that would make other good questions, would be things like, let me see here. So how, a good question, for example, would be how does serotonergic regulation impact breathing, and how is that related to sudden death syndrome? That would make a really excellent question, so make sure you understand how these things work together. This is a good slide. These two are good for that. Another potential good question would be related to how these serotonergic neurons influence the processing of pain. And so again, you're going to want to talk about sensory information ascending to these neurons, telling you that there is some sort of painful stimuli happening, and then these serotonin neurons then projecting back down in a descending pathway back to the dorsal horn to then regulate that pain response. Make sense? So those are two potential good questions. And this would also make a good question, right? So understanding how arousal in the ascending reticular activating system contributes to personality. So in other words, who has what type of cortical arousal? What does it mean to have a lower threshold for arousal? And then what does this actually look like behaviorally? Make sense? I do not expect you to know which wave is influenced. I would expect you to know that that you see differential activation on an EEG between introverts and extroverts. Make sense? All right, you're good to go like 10 minutes.